December 12th. Hey, just a quick note here that the IDF says it now controls some 40% of all territory in Gaza. The key point there, folks, that is the territory above ground. The tunnels beneath Gaza, which stretch some 300 miles throughout the strip, continue to be a major problem that the IDF is trying to rectify. And now they are taking a new tact, I guess you could say. And the Wall Street Journal is reporting that the Israel Defense Forces are now flooding the tunnels in Gaza with seawater from the Mediterranean Sea. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. I heard this reported last week. It's old news. Actually, no, it's not. There were rumblings and reports last week, yes, that Israel might be considering flooding the tunnels in Gaza with seawater. It's one of many options the IDF was considering. Now, here at the Watchman, we tried to be very careful, dot all our I's, cross all our T's before we report on something. And I said, look, and I talked to some sources in the Israel Defense Forces on the ground. They said, look, the IDF right now is neither confirming nor denying. I can't say what we are doing. So we held off. Just talking to the Watchman team, I said, you know what? It's a massive story if it is indeed legit, if it is 100% accurate, but I'm just not quite sure. I don't want to put something out there as fact if it is not accurate. Yes, there are reports circulating that Israel is doing it, considering doing it, but I need confirmation. Again, I spoke to a source in the IDF, and today the Wall Street Journal, which is, no matter what you think of the Wall Street Journal's reporting on other issues, maybe domestic issues, when it comes to international affairs, the Wall Street Journal is pretty solid journalistically. And the Wall Street Journal today published a pretty in-detail piece quoting U.S. officials who are saying, yes, Israel has begun flooding those Gaza tunnels, those Hamas terror tunnels in Gaza. And could it be a game changer? Now, U.S. officials were quoted in this piece. Israeli officials are still declining to comment on the tunnel operations. And that's what my source in the IDF told me over the weekend. He said, look, and this is someone who has pretty intimate knowledge of what's going on right now with the tunnel operations. He said, look, we're not confirming or denying, but either way, we probably won't say anything about it. If we are indeed flooding the tunnels, we're not going to say anything about it until after the war, or at least after that operation's done, after the dust settles, or should I say after the water settles. You're not going to hear anything from us definitively as to whether we are doing this. But this is a pretty well-sourced article in the Wall Street Journal that I want to dig into today. I think it's very relevant. I'm just going to put it out there right now, not having even quoted from this piece, which I'm going to do in a minute. I want to give you the specific details. And for all of you not having heard all the details yet, your gut instinct, knowing the ingenuity of the IDF and their daring, really ingenious operations over the years, just gut instinct, hearing it for the first time, do you think, and we've got thousands watching us now, we'll have thousands more before we are done, we have a highly educated audience here on the Watchman, do you think that flooding the tunnels is the way to go? What's your gut tell you right away off? Do you say, wow, you know what? That sounds like a pretty darn good idea. That's a way to solve this problem. Hey, flood them out. Flood these Hamas terrorists out with that seawater from the Mediterranean, gallons and gallons and gallons of it. Flood them out as best you can with the ultimate goal. Hey, maybe the seawater won't completely destroy, obviously, the entire 300-mile-long tunnel complex, this subterranean city that Hamas has spent years constructing underneath Gaza with no doubt millions upon millions, if not billions, of international aid that was supposed to go to the people of Gaza, instead going to build terror tunnels beneath Gaza. But I digress. What do you think, just gut instinct, first hearing of that, is your gut saying, wow, you know what? Pretty smart. I like it. That's a solution. My take on it, and not being a technical expert or an expert on anything like engineering or anything like that, I say, wow, you know what? That sounds like a pretty effective tactic from the IDF. Because look, the IDF has tried, obviously, airstrikes to cave in the tunnels, as we've documented here in the newscast over the past few weeks. They've sent dogs down there. They've sent drones down there. Look, for good reason, the IDF is reluctant to send Israeli soldiers down into those tunnels, into the bowels of hell beneath Gaza, because they're booby-trapped, because you have Hamas jihadists, Hamas terrorists waiting to spring out at you in the dark in these underground tunnels. So, of course, the IDF wisely is trying everything they can to avoid sending soldiers down there. But will the flooding work? I personally say, you know what? Seems like a pretty smart idea, a pretty wise way to go about this. Hey, you've tried other things. This seems like another tool in the IDF's toolbox that they need to use to combat this tunnel problem. We're going to break it down. I'm going to quote directly from this Wall Street Journal article, which is fascinating and very relevant. Again, in terms of the state of play and the good news, the IDF believes it now controls close to half of all territory in Gaza above ground. The key distinction there, of course. Northern Gaza, largely pacified, still pockets of fierce resistance in northern Gaza, but mostly the IDF has complete control of northern Gaza. Hamas has fled south, and the bulk of the fighting, as we have been reporting for you here in the newscast over the past week, has been in and around that Khan Yunis area in southern Gaza. Look for also fighting to increase around that Rafah border crossing near the Egyptian border. A good deal of Hamas's weapons flow through that Rafah crossing. So it seems the IDF will have to deal with that as well. Before we dig into the flooding of the tunnels a little bit more in depth, hey, quick shout out, quick praise report, and a big thank you to everyone. We just reached 850,000 subscribers today here on the channel. So, hey, everyone watching, thanks so much. We can't thank you enough. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your viewership. And someone says now, hey, you're just asking if this should be done, the flooding of the tunnels. It's been reported for days that this has already been done. Actually, it hasn't. And if you missed the top of this newscast, I explained, you might say, this isn't breaking news. Actually, it is, because what's been reported about the tunnels, again, the flooding of the tunnels in the past 7 days has been speculation. Perhaps Israel is doing this. Israel's considering doing this. Now we have pretty rock solid confirmation that, yes, Israel is doing this. So now we can report on it with a degree of certainty and credibility, whereas if you just throw it out there a week ago, Israel's flooding the tunnels with no backup and just based on hearsay, that's not very credible, in my view, at least. So I think we were smart and we were careful about when to report on this. And now we are, because we have some good sourcing here to say, okay, this sounds legit. This is really happening. So that's why we held off a few days on reporting on the flooding of the tunnels. Journalistically, I hope that makes sense, and that you understand we have to be, look, again, we have to dot all our I's and cross all of our T's here on the Watchmen, or we lose credibility if we just rush out there with something wildly and throw it out there without sourcing and double sourcing. Hey, with these issues, they're so complex at times. You really need to make sure you know what you're talking about, that it's accurate. And listen, number two, folks, if you mess up once, it's unfortunate, but many times people will write you off and say that person has lost credibility. So we really, all we've got here is our credibility, and we want to maintain our trust with our audience. That's why we want to report accurate information. And if it's not 100% verified, we can say this reportedly, this is being considered. So we try to be very smart there. Anyway, that's our take on it. And the thank you again for that 850,000 subscriber mark. Big thank you. Approaching 1 million subscribers very soon, God willing. And that's not for our glory or edification. That is to get this message out far and wide for such a time as this. So if you're just joining us and you have not subscribed, hey, join us here as Watchmen and Women on the Wall every day. Click that subscribe button, the notification bell. We'd love to have you here every single day for such a time as this. Now, we want to dig into the tunnels. We want to dig, obviously, also into a little bit more into Hezbollah, into the Houthis, what's happening there, but also the Biden administration with some very disturbing comments regarding Israel, regarding Benjamin Netanyahu, that we really want to break down here. That is absolutely, to me, an important story that you're going to want to know about. So we're going to break that down as well. And a good place to start, though, is the tunnel story. And by the way, Hostages, obviously, are still being held in those tunnels ostensibly. So you have to figure that the IDF has good intel in terms of where those hostages are. And they're not going to just flood a tunnel where you have Israeli hostages being held. Now, here's what the Wall Street Journal is reporting when it comes to the flooding of the tunnels, I should say, a vast network stretching again some 300 miles. Excuse me. Israel's military has begun to pump, this reported today, Israel's military has begun to pump seawater into Hamas's vast complex of tunnels in Gaza, according to U.S. officials briefed on the Israeli military's operations, part of an intensive effort to destroy the underground infrastructure that has underpinned Hamas's operations. And by the way, when we report on these issues, we'd rather be accurate than be first sometimes. It's better to be accurate than just jump out there and say, this is happening without all the details. Now we have many more specific details a few days on, now that this is being confirmed, that I can share with you. So it's just being smart. The move to flood the tunnels with water from the Mediterranean, which is in an early stage, is just one of several techniques Israel is using to try to clear the tunnels and destroy them. A spokesperson for the Israeli defense minister declined to comment, saying the tunnel operations are classified. Israeli officials say that Hamas's vast underground system has been key to its operations on the battlefield. The tunnel system, they say, is used by Hamas to maneuver fighters across the battlefield and store the group's rockets and munitions. It enables the group's leaders to command and control their forces. Of course, hostages are being held inside tunnels as well, Israel believes. So the utility of using seawater in a vast underground labyrinth that extends for roughly 300 miles and includes thick blast doors is still being evaluated by the Israelis, according to U.S. officials. Flooding the tunnels, which would likely be a weeks-long process. Again, if you just joined us, I'm quoting from this Wall Street Journal piece today. Flooding the tunnels began around the time Israel added 2 more pumps to the 5 pumps it installed last month. And they conducted some initial tests as well, according to U.S. officials. Here's where it gets interesting. Some Biden administration officials have been concerned that using seawater might not be effective, but could endanger Gaza's freshwater supply. Egypt in 2015 used seawater to flood tunnels operated by smugglers under the Rafah, there it is again, the Rafah border crossing with Gaza, prompting complaints from nearby farmers about damaged crops. But other U.S. officials say the technique might help destroy portions of the tunnel network. The Wall Street Journal has previously reported that flooding the tunnels with seawater was under consideration. Key point there. The Wall Street Journal said, look, last week we said it was under consideration. Now we're saying this is a go. It's actually happening. That's why we're reporting it today. Very interesting. Military analysts have assessed that Israel has not destroyed most of this tunnel network yet, and that a variety of techniques will be needed to destroy or damage this underground system. In addition to the seawater, you've got robots, dogs, and drones, and liquid explosives. So, look, folks, it is a tough job to tackle this underground tunnel network. Clearly, it's really unprecedented in many ways. Yes, there are tunnel networks. They were in Vietnam. There are under North Korea along that South Korea border, no doubt. But this Hamas underground, essentially underground cities, I mean, a subterranean city, a subterranean strip beneath the Gaza Strip, it's pretty unprecedented, folks, in a lot of ways. And they are armed to the teeth underneath in these tunnels. And look, Gaza is Hamas literally, it's completely evil, demonic, and diabolical. Since Hamas seized control, voted by the people of Gaza, voted in an election into power in 2006, and then violently wresting complete control of the Strip from the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, in 2007. Since then, Hamas has literally spent over 15 years building Gaza into, and IDF officials have said this, they're just stunned by what they're finding there, building it literally into a terror fortress where civilians, some 2 million, just so happen to live. I hate to say it that way, but that's the reality Hamas has created. They have made it this tiny coastal strip, again, a terror fortress where the civilians have the misfortune of living under this Hamas terror rule, this demonic death cult, modern day Nazis, only in different uniforms. This is a movement that must be crushed. It is inherently evil. And the IDF is going about the business of doing exactly that. Let me know what you know about the tunnels, or what you think about the tunnels. And I mentioned that Hamas must be crushed. Pretty common sense, right? Considering what happened on October 7th, considering what the IDF is uncovering right now. Again, it's a terror fortress. They've never seen anything like it. And these are, look, battle-hardened, battle-tested Israeli soldiers, Israeli military officials who've pretty much seen it all in the region. But Hamas has literally, in just purely demonic fashion, taken all the billions of dollars of international aid that's flooded into Gaza, and they have used it. They've placed it, number one, in their own coffers. People like Khaled Mashal, Ismail Haniyeh, these Hamas leaders living abroad, they're living like kings. Apparently, billions in their bank accounts. Where did that money come from? I wonder. And secondly, Hamas is using it to build tunnels, to build rockets, et cetera, et cetera. The same things they're using, the fuel that now Israel is allowing to be delivered into the Gaza Strip, Hamas is using that for rockets. This is how they operate. It's just purely evil. It's such disgusting levels of evil that it needs to be destroyed. And the IDF is on their way to doing that. And yet, we have Western leaders. Now, to me, the IDF has to finish the job, right? And we've discussed this here in the newscast, if Israel stops short and does not finish the job and prematurely agrees to a disastrous ceasefire with Hamas, then it leaves Hamas to fight another day. Iran and Hezbollah are emboldened, and it's a complete disaster. So Israel's not going to do that. Israel has been adamant they're going to finish the job despite mounting international pressure, including chiefly here in the West where I'm sitting right now, I'm sad to say. But this gives you an example. Hamas needs to be crushed. Israel's on its way to doing that. Hamas cannot be allowed to fight another day, to live to fight another day. And yet, listen to this, folks. Quoting from the Times of Israel here, just reading off my phone. The prime ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are backing efforts toward a Gaza ceasefire in a joint statement. Here's the direct quote from these prime ministers in this joint statement. Of course, Justin Trudeau, are you really surprised? The Prime Minister of Canada. He says, along with his counterparts in Australia and New Zealand, we are alarmed at the diminishing safe space for civilians in Gaza. The price of defeating Hamas cannot be the continuous suffering of all Palestinian civilians, they say in the statement. They also call for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. Well, how do you think that's going to happen unless you continue to pound Hamas? Hamas came crawling to the negotiating table a few weeks ago because they were begging for that mini truce that lasted a week so they could breathe after being pounded into submission by Israel. That's the only thing that brought Hamas to the table in terms of releasing hostages. So if you agree to a ceasefire, what makes you think Hamas will magically just hand the civilians over, or the civilian hostages and Israeli soldiers who were held there over? And they also lecture the leaders of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia that while defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law. Hey, listen, Israel knows that better than anyone. And Israel has done that time and time again. This is the most humane fighting force in the history of modern warfare, probably all warfare. I say that without hesitation. A big statement, I know. I say without hesitation. The extraordinary lengths that the IDF goes to avoid civilian casualties are unprecedented. And you might say, well, how are those civilians in Gaza dying? Thousands have been killed. First of all, Hamas is using civilians willfully and gladly as human shields, putting the IDF in an absolute no-win situation. The IDF over the years has called off airstrike after airstrike. operation after operation, sometimes putting its own soldiers at risk in order to avoid civilian casualties. Anyone who knows what goes on there and has intellectual honesty and actually studied the issue knows exactly what the IDF does and what the IDF does not do. Hamas using human shields, putting civilians intentionally in it is a pillar of Hamas's war strategy. Civilians as human shields. Sick, but this is who they are. Hamas also launched the war on October 7th, and Israel must respond. Again, no-win situation for Israel. Israel needs, not once, needs to crush Hamas. And Hamas, not Israel. Hamas is intentionally targeting civilians and intentionally dragging civilians into the conflict. And these leaders know that. They know. They know the lengths Israel goes to avoid civilian casualties. You don't need to lecture Israel on respecting international humanitarian law. Where's your lecture for Hamas, the quote-unquote governing body in Gaza, which again was voted for by the people of Gaza in 2006? The statement continues by the leaders of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. They want to see the temporary truce resumed, and they support urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire. This cannot be one-sided, they say. Hamas must release all hostages, stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields, and lay down its arms. Is that going to happen? What do you think, folks? I think this is pretty obvious. But is Hamas, quote, going to release all hostages, stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields, and lay down its arms, disarm, if Israel agrees to a ceasefire? Or is Hamas going to, more likely, to release the hostages, stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields, and lay down its arms if the IDF beats them into submission? What's more likely? You tell me. And then they say, these three leaders, quote unquote, there is no role for Hamas in the future governance of Gaza. Agreed. How do you aim to accomplish that if Israel agrees to a premature ceasefire now, leaves Hamas relatively intact, including its leadership, most of it, and leaves Hamas to fight another day? How do you propose, prime ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to disarm Hamas and have them step back from any role in the governance of Gaza if they're not utterly defeated? This is a vicious, genocidal terrorist organization. They're not the diplomatic types. And yet we have the Biden administration as well today. Again, I want to quote directly so you hear their own words, and we've got thousands with us here. Welcome from all points around the world joining us right now. Just want to quote directly here. President Biden in particular, some comments he made, and I'm just pulling them up, folks. Here we go. Biden today, speaking to apparently, let's see, was it a campaign event for the 2024 presidential election? He said, and I quote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's hardline government has made it very difficult for the international community to back Israel in the war against Hamas. Okay, wait a minute. The hardline government, quote unquote, is not involved in the daily war planning. The main people that Biden has an issue with, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, they're not in the war cabinet, to the point where Israel, in essence, formed a unity government of sorts here. When the war started, Israel brought in Benny Gantz, who's a centrist, brought him into the war cabinet. The former defense minister Gantz, a centrist politically. So Gantz is in that war cabinet. Zaki Hanegbi, Ron Dermer, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and Bibi. They're the main pillars of that war cabinet. These are not seen as hardline, fire-breathing extremists. So no, the, quote, hardline government is not the issue here, because they're not the ones making the, if you have an issue with the way Israel is conducting the war, Biden administration, then your issue is with the war cabinet. They're the ones making the big decisions here. And again, that war cabinet, they're not seen as, they're conservative, they're on the right, but they're not seen as fire-breathing wild men, needless to say. Biden goes on to say, Netanyahu is a good friend, but I think he has to change. Why? What does he have to change? What's he doing wrong, Joe? And this government in Israel is making it very difficult for him to move. In what way? Right now, he seems to be moving. The only difficulty he has moving right now, in moving, is you and your administration, which is trying to tie one hand behind his back and Israel, the war cabinet's back, as they try to conduct this war to crush Hamas after they were attacked on October 7th. And by the way, he made these comments, as I mentioned, at a campaign fundraiser in D.C. He goes on to say, this is the most conservative government in Israel's history. Okay, and I could argue that this current administration in the U.S. is the most left-wing government in America's history. They not only want to have retribution, he says, and again, I'm just quoting from my phone. He says of Israel, they not only want to have retribution, which they should for what Hamas did, but against all Palestinians, and that's not what Israel's doing. It's targeted at Hamas, but it gets a little bit more difficult to maneuver and eliminate Hamas when they literally put women and children in front of them as human shields and station their rocket launchers in civilian buildings. But he says that Israel is indiscriminately bombing Gaza. They're starting to lose international support, Biden says, by the indiscriminate bombing that takes place. Now, folks, look indiscriminate up in the dictionary. And he knows, Biden knows this is false. He knows, he's talked to Bibi. He knows how Israel conducts war. Blinken knows this as well. But they're caving to two things. Number one, international pressure. And number two, their own left-wing base. The squad members, the AOCs, the Rashida Tlaibs of the world who are rabidly anti-Israel, and the radicals on college campuses, that leg of the Democrat Party's base, that's who he's catering to, the far left of his party, and the international pressure, the UN, etc. He knows that Israel is not indiscriminately bombing the Palestinians, in Gaza in particular, Palestinians. He knows that. And yet he says it. It's a falsehood. He knows the great pains Israel is taking to avoid civilian casualties, and yet he says it. Folks, words matter. And in the Middle East, words matter. And in the world right now, as Israel is, yes, indeed, being isolated, or many are attempting to isolate the world's one and only Jewish state, Israel needs affirmation by the United States that, hey, they're doing the right thing. And Biden says in this speech, look, they need to eliminate Hamas. We support that. But every time he and Blinken, the Secretary of State, say this, it's accompanied by a very large caveat. But Israel must do everything it can to avoid civilian casualties, follow the rules of war, no indiscriminate bombing. Again, newsflash. Israel knows that. The last thing Israel's leaders need are to make the international community mad and send the world into an uproar, gnashing its teeth and pointing its finger at Israel. Don't you think Israel wants to avoid that? Because Israel, unlike any nation in the world, it faces scrutiny unlike any nation in the world. Unbelievable, relentless international pressure and scrutiny for this tiny nation the size of the state of New Jersey. So again, Israel knows this. You don't have to lecture Israel's leaders. They know this very well. They know it. And yet again, Biden has to play lip service to his left-wing base and to the international community, quote unquote, and the UN, the EU, etc., who are, again, gnashing their teeth, the likes of the prime ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who we quoted a few minutes ago. But I have to say, Israel is staying the course. And I was a bit concerned during the mini truce. Yes, I was concerned that Israel would lose momentum 2 weeks ago, ceasing operations for a week when they had such momentum. But Israel started back up again and has not looked back and has really moved, I mean, in an enlightening fashion into southern Gaza and largely pacified the north, where again, there's still pockets of major resistance in the north, but Israel is getting that under control rather swiftly. So I have to say, I'm very happy to see that Israel's leaders thus far have had spines of steel. And indiscriminate bombing, and somebody just laid that out here. I'm just looking at our very lively chat here. Bombing indiscriminately would mean just not even caring what you're bombing, kind of like what Vladimir Putin has done over the years. Just doing it, just carpet bombing without any regard for human life. I don't know who's down there, but we're bombing. Anyone who knows anything about the IDF's rules of engagement knows that's not the case. And yet we have this lip service paid by Western leaders, holding Israel to completely unfair and unrealistic expectations. Crush Hamas, destroy Hamas, but there can't be one civilian casualty. That's essentially, I mean, no one wants to see any civilian casualties, obviously. It's tragic. But it's difficult for Israel when it's attacked. It's invaded on October 7th, invaded. Southern Israel is ravaged. 1,200 people are murdered. Over 200 more are dragged away into captivity. I don't know. It's kind of hard for Israel to navigate that. And they're doing a pretty darn good job, in my view. And the ultimate goal, like a laser for Israel right now, destroy Hamas and secure the release of the hostages. And Israeli leaders, military officials have made this clear throughout, avoid as many civilian casualties as they possibly can. Why do you think Israel spent 10 days at least imploring civilians in northern Gaza to go south before Israel invaded on the ground? What other military would do that? Would the Iranian regime do that? Would Vladimir Putin do that? Would China and North Korea, would they do that? Would Hamas do that, or Hezbollah? All these sinister forces that the world seems to be cheering on right now? Would they do that? Even would some Western powers do that? Over 10 days, Israel spent. Hey, everyone, we're coming in. Evacuate the northern half of Gaza because we're coming in. And Hamas wouldn't let the civilians leave, to the point they were shooting at civilians who were trying to flee southward. Folks, let's tell the truth here. The reality on the ground. Now, speaking of the reality on the ground, real quick, Hezbollah, Hamas, the two H's, Israel carried out airstrikes in and around Damascus and eliminated some Hezbollah operatives. Now you have projectiles launched out of Syria. Lebanon, Syria, side by side, will be the site, I believe, of that great northern war where Israel will eventually be forced to face down those forces to the north. The Houthis in Yemen yesterday opened fire on a Norwegian ship which was bound for Israel. Now, Israel has responded to the Hezbollah fire. Israel and the U.S. have yet to respond in any forceful manner toward the Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. How long can Israel wait? The U.S. is in the Red Sea, Israel obviously on the Red Sea, but there's been U.S. destroyers in the Red Sea, and thankfully, Israel and the U.S. have been shooting down these incoming Houthi projectiles bound for a lot in Israel. But how long will the Houthis be permitted to do this? Because they're emboldened, and they believe right now, at the behest of their Iranian masters, that they essentially control the Red Sea. What's going in and coming out of the Red Sea. That's unsustainable. So, folks, as the world's attention is focused on Gaza right now, watch the northern front first and foremost, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Syria. Keep an eye on Yemen, because I believe Israel eventually, and it might be a little while. I know the U.S. has been trying to restrain Israel, surprise, surprise, because the U.S. does not want to see the war expand, but it's what they want and what the reality on the ground demands. Israel cannot allow Hezbollah to continue perched on its northern border, and it cannot allow the Houthis to continue to harass Israeli and Israeli-owned shipping and continue to launch rockets in the direction of Israel. You do the math. So, folks, thanks so much for joining us here today. We'll be back with you tomorrow. I believe that we're going live earlier tomorrow. And look, if you like what you're hearing when it comes to Hezbollah, Hamas, you can go right here. You can click any other stories. We've got archives here, categories here in the channel you can check out. You want Hezbollah, Lebanon? We've got it. You want the Houthis, Yemen, Hamas? We've got it. Russia, prophecy? We've got it here in the channel. So be sure to check out all of our categories, all of our archives here. A lot of good material that will keep you equipped, keep you knowledgeable, and allow you to be a light in the darkness. I think you'd rather know than not know about what we're facing right now. So keep it all in prayer. We'll be with you tomorrow. I believe we're rolling around 12:30 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. We will confirm that in the morning. Until then, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an upload, and tap the bell icon so you're notified every time a new video is posted. And don't forget to share your thoughts, insights, and comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow.